The nightmare did not start with a violent screaming match or a dramatic corporate boardroom coup. It began on a bitterly cold Thanksgiving evening at my father's sprawling, aggressively opulent Connecticut estate, holding the trembling hand of a 6-year-old boy named Leo. Leo had not spoken a single word since he was abruptly placed in my care through the emergency foster system a grueling week prior. He communicated his terror exclusively by tugging the hem of my winter coat and staring at the world with wide, perpetually frightened eyes. He was a broken child who needed a safe harbor, but stepping into my father's house was the equivalent of walking directly into a shark tank covered in blood. My father, Charles, is the formidable CEO of Vanguard Asset Management. He is a man whose miserable existence revolves around society status, ruthless financial power, and demanding control over his children's lives. When I refused to blindly follow his suffocating life plan and join his corporate empire, opting instead to build my own independent forensic accounting firm from the ground up, I instantly became the permanent family disappointment. The designated black sheep. "You are always out of step," Charles roared, slamming his crystal whiskey glass onto the long mahogany dining table, the amber liquid splashing over the rim. "You have been a continuous, profound disappointment since the day your mother died. I explicitly offered you a silver platter at Vanguard. I offered you a guaranteed executive salary, and instead, you stubbornly opened a pathetic, insignificant little accounting firm to audit nobodies in a rundown part of the city. And now you aggressively bring this into my house," he continued, gesturing with pure disgust toward Leo, who whimpered softly and buried his face deeper into my heavy coat. My younger sister, Brittany, sat lazily across the table, swirling her expensive red wine with a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. As the undisputed golden child and current vice president of Vanguard, Brittany never missed a single opportunity to ruthlessly kick me when I was already down. She leaned affectionately against her husband, DeAndre, the impeccably dressed, hyper-ambitious chief financial officer of my father's firm. They were the ultimate power couple in my father's eyes. Slick, ruthlessly corporate, and entirely focused on accumulating wealth and status at any human cost. "I cannot genuinely believe you are dragging a broken charity case into our private holiday dinner," Brittany scoffed, casually adjusting her heavy diamond necklace so the massive chandelier light would catch it perfectly. "You cannot even afford the basic rent on your dingy little apartment downtown, Cassidy. How on earth are you going to raise a disabled, mute child? With what money? Your morals?" DeAndre chuckled, a dark, unpleasant sound, shaking his head with a condescending smirk. "Maybe she honestly thinks she can audit her way into a massive trust fund," he murmured, shooting my father a knowing, highly look. "You need to stop playing the desperate savior, Cassidy. It is highly embarrassing for the family brand to have you constantly parading around like a tragic martyr. You look pathetic." I tightened my protective grip on Leo's small hand, my blood boiling with years of heavily suppressed anger and resentment. "I am a forensic accountant," I stated, keeping my voice dangerously level, refusing to let them see me break. "I aggressively track missing money, I uncover complex financial fraud, and I catch corporate criminals for a living. I am perfectly capable of supporting myself and providing a safe, loving home for a child who desperately needs one." "Not as my daughter, you are not," Charles spat venomously. "I am completely, finally done funding your pathetic delusions of independence and dealing with your constant, exhausting rebellion. You are cut off, you are entirely disowned. Now get out of my house right this second before I call my private security team to physically throw both of you out into the freezing rain." I did not shed a single tear. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my grief. I simply picked up my coat, lifted Leo into my arms to completely protect him from their hostile, toxic glares, and walked out the heavy front door, leaving my miserable family behind in their gilded cage. The very next morning, I was sitting in my modest, quiet kitchen, making a bowl of warm oatmeal for Leo when 3 black armored SUVs abruptly pulled up to my apartment building, blocking the street. I watched through the frosty window as a tall, sharply dressed man stepped confidently out of the lead vehicle. He exuded an aura of terrifying authority and immense wealth. Two bodyguards flanked him instantly as he walked, purposefully toward my front door. When I cautiously opened the door, Leo peeked nervously around my legs, gripping my jeans tightly. The intimidating man immediately dropped to his knees, right there on the dirty, scuffed hallway floor, completely heedless of his expensive, custom-tailored suit. Tears instantly flooded his dark eyes, completely shattering his powerful stoic facade. "Leo," he choked out, his deep, resonant voice breaking with overwhelming emotion. "My boy," to my absolute shock, Leo let go of my leg and took a tentative, shaky step forward. The man did not grab him or force a demanding embrace. He just held his arms wide open, waiting incredibly patiently until Leo rushed forward and buried his face deeply in the man's broad chest. The man stood up slowly, carrying Leo effortlessly in his strong arms, and turned to look at me. His demeanor shifted instantly from a grieving father to a highly formidable titan of industry. "I am Dominic," he said quickly, regaining his imposing composure. I recognized the name instantly. He was Dominic Banks, the renowned, notoriously private tech and commercial real estate billionaire I had frequently read about in top global financial journals. "Are you the woman who saved my son?" he asked, his intense gaze locking onto mine. Dominic's sharp jaw tightened with suppressed, violent protective fury. "My ex-wife ruthlessly kidnapped him during a highly bitter custody dispute over a year ago. She went completely off the grid, and I have had top private investigators searching the globe ever since. Apparently, when her stolen funds finally ran out, she abandoned him at a bus station and cowardly fled the country. The state system completely failed to match his fingerprints immediately. If you had not taken him in and kept him safe, he would have been lost in an overcrowded group home." Leo clung tightly to my neck when I reached out to gently stroke his hair, but he kept one arm firmly wrapped around his father's shoulders. Dominic noticed the deep, immediate attachment the traumatized boy had already formed with me. He pulled a sleek leather checkbook from his inner suit pocket, quickly signed a blank check, and held it out to me. "Name your exact price," Dominic said, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Move into my private estate today. I want you as his permanent private guardian to help him transition safely. And after looking deeply into your professional background last night, I want to hire you exclusively as my lead financial consultant." Before I could even process the shocking blank check resting lightly in my hand, the loud screech of expensive tires echoed through the quiet neighborhood street. I looked past Dominic's towering bodyguards to see a familiar silver Bentley pull up behind the armored SUVs. The doors opened and Brittany and DeAndre stepped out onto the cracked pavement. They had clearly come to gloat, to mock my living situation in the daylight, or to deliver some final, cruel financial threat from my father. But their smug, arrogant smiles vanished instantly. They froze completely in their tracks the absolute moment they recognized the famous, untouchable billionaire standing on my dingy doorstep. Brittany stepped onto the pavement in her red-soled stilettos, her eyes widening instantly as she aggressively calculated the staggering net worth of the man standing in my entryway. DeAndre quickly adjusted the sharp lapels of his custom-tailored suit, his predatory corporate instincts immediately snapping into overdrive. They had initially come to gloat over my painful disownment. But finding Dominic Banks here presented an incredible opportunity they were far too greedy to ignore. Vanguard Asset Management was bleeding money. I knew it from analyzing their public filings, and the entire financial district heavily suspected it. They desperately, urgently needed a massive anchor investor to stay afloat. And Dominic Banks was the biggest, most elusive whale in the entire ocean. Brittany did not even look at me. She shoved aggressively past my shoulders so hard she nearly knocked little Leo off balance. She plastered on a syrupy, heavily practiced smile, thrusting her perfectly manicured hand toward the billionaire. "Dominic, what an absolute pleasure to run into you here," Brittany announced loudly. "I am Brittany, Charles's daughter and the vice president of Vanguard. We have been trying tirelessly to coordinate a sit-down with your acquisition team for months." DeAndre stepped up right beside her, exuding that slick manufactured charm he used to ruthlessly close deals. It is in small world, Dominic. Charles sends his highest regards. We actually have a lucrative proposal that aligns with your planned expansion into the commercial tech sector. The air around us seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dominic did not take Brittany's hand. He did not even acknowledge her presence. He left her standing there, her hand hovering awkwardly and embarrassingly in the empty space between them. Instead, Dominic turned his broad shoulders entirely away from the arrogant power couple. He lowered himself back down to one knee, completely ignoring the dirt on the hallway floor, and brought himself right back to Leo's eye level. He spoke softly to his son, promising him fiercely that he was safe now. Then Dominic looked up at me. The deep gratitude in his piercing gaze was absolute. "Thank you for protecting him, Cassidy," he said, his deep voice carrying a quiet, lethal intensity. "You have absolutely no idea what this truly means to me." Brittany let out an indignant, highly offended huff, utterly baffled as to why a titan of industry was completely ignoring her to thank the family disappointment. She finally noticed Leo hiding behind my legs. She wrinkled her nose in pure disgust, clearly recognizing the boy from the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner the night before. DeAndre cleared his throat loudly, aggressively determined to hijack the moment. "Dominic, I know this is a highly unconventional setting, but Vanguard is currently positioned to offer you unprecedented, guaranteed returns. Charles specifically wanted me to personally spearhead this massive partnership." Dominic stood up slowly, his towering, imposing frame completely dwarfing DeAndre. He signaled his security team with a flick of his wrist. Two massive bodyguards immediately stepped forward to gently escort Leo into the climate-controlled safety of the armored SUV. While Dominic was momentarily turned away, overseeing his son's safety, DeAndre leaned in incredibly close to my ear. His polished corporate veneer vanished entirely, instantly replaced by a vicious, threatening glare. "Do not mess this up for us, Cassidy," he hissed venomously under his breath. "You owe this family your absolute loyalty. Keep your mouth shut and let me pitch. Dad paid off your massive mountain of student loans so you would not end up homeless on the street. The absolute least you can do is stand aside and let the real professionals work." I did not whisper back. I did not shrink away. I squared my shoulders and spoke at full volume, fiercely ensuring my voice carried across the driveway so Dominic and his entire security team could hear every single word. "Dad did not pay a single microscopic cent of my tuition, DeAndre," I announced clearly, my voice ringing like a bell. "I paid off my own student loans by working 3 brutal, exhausting jobs, straight through my accounting degree. I was scrubbing dirty diner floors and balancing corporate ledgers until 3 in the morning, while you and Brittany were eagerly maxing out my father's corporate credit cards on luxury ski trips in Aspen." Dominic slowly turned back around. He casually buttoned his suit jacket, his expression terrifyingly unreadable. He sized up DeAndre and Brittany with a look of chilling disgust. He saw right through their expensive clothes and their hollow, corporate titles. He saw the same arrogance that I had quietly endured my life. DeAndre, desperate to salvage his ruined pitch, stepped forward rapidly, with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Please excuse my sister-in-law, Dominic. She has always been a bit highly unstable. She just runs a tiny, completely insignificant bookkeeping business. Let us focus on the real numbers. Vanguard can absolutely guarantee a 20% return on a $100 million investment. We have the proprietary algorithms to make it happen effortlessly." Dominic looked DeAndre dead in the eye. A slow, highly dangerous smile crept onto the billionaire's handsome face. "I am always open to carefully reviewing ambitious financial proposals," Dominic said smoothly. DeAndre's tense shoulders dropped in immediate relief. He shot Brittany a highly triumphant look, deeply convinced his slick talking had actually worked. He eagerly reached into his suit jacket for a premium business card. "Excellent. I can have my team send the entire Vanguard portfolio over to your office by noon today." Dominic raised a single hand, stopping DeAndre completely in his tracks. "Do not send it to my office," Dominic commanded, his voice echoing with authority. "As of this morning, I have restructured my personal wealth management team. You will need to submit your portfolio, your proprietary algorithms, And your internal liquidity reports to my new lead financial consultant. Dominic did not say a word, he simply raised his arm and pointed a single decisive finger right at me. Send absolutely everything to Cassidy, Dominic stated, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet driveway. She will be auditing Vanguard's books personally. If she explicitly approves your numbers, we will talk. If she finds a single microscopic discrepancy, I will ensure nobody in the entire financial sector ever takes your calls again. The absolute horror that washed over Brittany and DeAndre's faces was a masterpiece. Their jaws literally dropped. The color completely drained from DeAndre's face as the crushing reality of the situation crashed down on him. Their failing company, their massive executive salaries, and their desperate bid for $100 million lifeline now rested entirely in the hands of the very sister they had cruelly thrown out into the freezing rain just 12 hours ago. The wrought iron gates of Dominic's fortified estate closed securely behind us, shutting out the chaos of the morning. Within mere hours, my life had transformed. Dominic generously provided a sprawling, beautiful wing of the mansion for Leo and me. I immediately set up my advanced forensic accounting software in the state-of-the-art home office he offered. Dual monitors hummed to life, displaying rows of encrypted, scrolling financial data. Leo sat quietly at the heavy oak desk right beside me, a fresh box of crayons scattered across a large sketch pad. For the first time since I met him, the constant, terrified trembling in his small shoulders had completely stopped. I glanced over from my complex spreadsheets. He was carefully drawing a picture of a house, pressing a blue crayon firmly onto the thick paper. He slid the drawing toward me, his wide, expressive eyes carefully watching my reaction. I smiled gently, tracing the simple lines of the house. I tapped the paper and told him it was an absolute masterpiece. He did not speak a single word, but he leaned his head heavily against my arm for just a brief, beautiful second. That tiny monumental gesture of trust fueled a fierce, unstoppable protective fire inside me. I was going to secure Vanguard's ledgers and ruthlessly make sure my toxic family never came near this child or his father again. To conduct a full, comprehensive audit of Vanguard asset management, I desperately needed the physical, heavily encrypted hard drive securely stored in the safe at my downtown office. I left Leo safely under the watchful eyes of Dominic and his elite security team and drove swiftly into the city. My firm was located on the third floor of a modest pre-war brick building. It was practical, stripped of unnecessary luxury, and funded by my own sweat and grueling late nights. I had just unlocked my office door and started seamlessly transferring encrypted files when the glass doors at the front of the suite crashed open. Charles marched aggressively into my reception area like a conquering general invading a foreign nation. Brittany trailed right behind him, her nose wrinkled in absolute, open disgust as she scanned my sensible furniture and inexpensive decor. My father did not bother with pleasant greetings. His face was a terrifying mask of simmering, unhinged rage. "You have deliberately ignored 17 of my phone calls, Cassidy," Charles barked loudly, his booming voice echoing harshly off the exposed brick walls. "I absolutely do not care what kind of manipulative, twisted game you are playing with this billionaire, but you are going to pick up your damn phone when I summon you." Brittany scoffed loudly, running a manicured finger critically over my reception desk and checking it for dust. "You are acting for someone who operates out of a glorified broom closet," she sneered venomously. "DeAndre told us what happened in your pathetic driveway. You actually convinced Dominic to let you review our proposal. So, here is what is going to happen." She took a highly step forward. "You are going to immediately approve Vanguard's pitch. You are going to fiercely tell Dominic that our financials are absolutely flawless. And you are going to rigorously make sure he wires that $50 million investment by Friday afternoon." I crossed my arms, completely unbothered, staring down my golden child sister. "Or what?" Charles stepped forward, aggressively invading my personal space, desperately trying to use his physical presence to deeply intimidate me, exactly just as he had done my entire childhood. "Or I wipe this pathetic little hobby of yours off the map," he threatened, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying growl. You seem to have forgotten who holds the master lease to this commercial property. Vanguard Asset Management owns this building, Cassidy. I allowed you to rent this space purely because your mother begged me to look out for you before she died. But my patience is gone. He slammed his heavy hand down violently on my desk. You will guarantee Dominic explicitly signs that contract. If you fiercely refuse, I will serve you with a ruthless 24-hour eviction notice. I will personally throw your computers, your confidential files, and your cheap desk out onto the dirty sidewalk by tomorrow morning. Your pathetic firm will be dead. The sheer overwhelming entitlement in his voice would have terrified me a year ago. It would have fiercely made me shrink back and apologize. But looking at the pathetic two of them now, desperate and sweating under their expensive clothes, I felt nothing but cold, calculated, fierce clarity. You always fiercely loved wielding this lease directly over my head, Dad, I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm. You reminded me at every Thanksgiving and every Christmas that I only had a roof over my business, because of your supposed incredible generosity. You loved making me feel incredibly small. You really should pay much closer attention to what your highly praised CFO son-in-law is doing fiercely behind your back. I stated cleanly. You absolutely do not hold the master lease anymore, Dad. Charles frowned, abruptly pulling his heavy reading glasses from his breast pocket. He leaned in aggressively to look at the bright screen. What kind of fabricated, pathetic garbage is this? It is the official county property registry, I explained cheerfully. Vanguard Asset Management explicitly sold this building 28 days ago. DeAndre authorized the quiet, desperate liquidation of 6 major commercial properties to quickly cover a bleeding liquidity crisis buried in your offshore accounts. You fiercely sold it to a private shell company called Blue Horizon LLC for a desperate cash injection. Brittany's face went completely pale. She looked at our father with wide eyes. Dad, what is she talking about? DeAndre never said anything about selling properties. Charles aggressively gripped the edge of the desk, his eyes frantically darting across the digital deed. This is completely impossible. Even if DeAndre liquidated the asset, the new management company still heavily honors the eviction clauses. I will just call the owners of Blue Horizon right now and have them violently throw you out themselves. I have powerful connections everywhere in this city. I smiled a slow, highly predatory grin that made my incredibly father actually take a hesitant step back. I pressed one final decisive button on my keyboard, bringing up the official incorporation documents for the shell company. You fiercely do not need to call them, I whispered, my voice heavily dripping with absolute satisfaction. Blue Horizon LLC is completely registered to me. My father stared at the screen, entirely unable to comprehend the massive betrayal. I bought this building entirely through a blind trust, using the massive profits strictly from my forensic contracts. You absolutely do not own this building anymore, Dad. I do, and you are fiercely trespassing on my private property. The silence in my downtown office after my father and sister furiously left was highly intoxicating, but I had absolutely no time to celebrate. Dominic had arranged for a private car to take me back to his sprawling estate, where a massive garment bag was already waiting securely on my bed. Dominic stood quietly in the doorway holding a velvet jewelry box. He told me that Vanguard Asset Management was absolutely not going to stop at empty threats, and that we desperately needed to make a very public, highly visible statement. He was attending the annual Global Horizon Charity Gala in Manhattan that evening, and he wanted me by his side, not just as a date, but as a severe warning to absolutely anyone in the financial sector who thought I was an easy target. The custom emerald silk gown he had procured fit perfectly. When I walked downstairs, little Leo actually clapped his hands, a bright, beautiful smile breaking through his usual fearful expression. I kissed his forehead gently, promising him I would be back safely before morning. The Manhattan Gala was a chaotic sea of flashing cameras, tailored tuxedos, and massive diamonds. Walking into the grand ballroom directly with Dominic felt like stepping securely into an impenetrable fortress. Billionaire senators and influential tech moguls practically lined up to shake his hand, and he introduced me to every single one of them as his brilliant lead financial consultant. For the absolute first time in my life, I was not the tragic family disappointment. I was a respected professional holding my own in the absolute highest echelon of New York society. But the beautiful illusion of safety shattered the moment I heard a shrill, artificially sweet voice violently cut through the smooth jazz playing gracefully in the background. I turned to see my sister Brittany aggressively, pushing her way through the crowded circle of elite guests, forcefully dragging my father and DeAndre right behind her. They had clearly paid an exorbitant, desperate amount to secure last-minute tickets, desperately trying to intercept Dominic in public. Brittany stopped a few feet away, her eyes raking viciously over my emerald gown with thinly veiled, absolute fury. She could not stand seeing me visibly thrive. It went against everything she had been taught to believe about her own inherent superiority. She stepped forward aggressively and raised her voice, firmly ensuring the surrounding circle of wealthy investors could hear every single word. "Dominic, what an incredible surprise to see you here with my sister," Brittany announced loudly, pressing her hand dramatically to her chest in a gesture of fake, theatrical concern. "I feel it is my duty as her family to warn you, Cassidy has a long documented history of severe mental instability. We had to forcefully bail her out of trouble constantly during her college years, because she completely could not handle the basic pressure of her coursework." She paused, making sure the crowd was listening intently. "She is highly prone to severe delusions and highly manipulative behavior. We are just so worried she is taking advantage of your incredible kindness, especially regarding your vulnerable son." The surrounding guests fell completely, awkwardly silent. Harsh whispers broke out. My father stood right behind Brittany, nodding firmly in solemn, manufactured grief. It was the exact same cruel, gaslighting tactic they had aggressively used since I was 18. Whenever I outshone Brittany, they painted me as crazy to invalidate my success. My chest tightened, a familiar panic rising swiftly in my throat. But before I could utter a single word in my own defense, Dominic stepped smoothly, imposingly in front of me. He did not look at my father. He locked his cold, calculating gaze directly onto Brittany. "Mental instability is a very serious accusation, Brittany," Dominic said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet ballroom. "But speaking of severe delusions, let us discuss the Vanguard Philanthropic Foundation you currently run. I had my team do a cursory audit of your public tax filings this afternoon. You claim to support underprivileged youth, yet your public records clearly show you spend 85% of your raised funds on excessive administrative costs, luxury galas like this one, and private jet travel. Less than 1% actually reaches any children." He took a step closer, his presence utterly terrifying. "You are absolutely not a philanthropist. You are running a glorified tax haven to fund your lavish wardrobe." The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd was entirely audible. Wealthy donors literally took a physical step away from Brittany. Her jaw snapped violently shut, her face turning an ugly blotchy red as absolute public humiliation washed over her. My father looked like he was going to have a massive heart attack right there, on the polished marble floor. While Dominic commanded the entire room, freezing my family in their tracks with brutal facts, DeAndre used the chaotic distraction to his advantage. I caught the subtle movement out of the corner of my eye. DeAndre quickly brushed past Dominic's executive assistant, bumping shoulders with him aggressively, and issuing a hasty, fake apology. I watched DeAndre slip his hand quickly back to his side, but the damage was already done. Dominic signaled smoothly for his security team. "We are leaving," he announced loud enough for the entire room to clearly hear. "The sickening stench of desperation in this corner of the room is ruining my evening." He placed his hand firmly on my lower back and guided me smoothly out of the ballroom, leaving my family standing in a circle of absolute public disgrace. The cool night air of Manhattan hit my face refreshingly as we climbed securely into the back of Dominic's waiting limousine. The thick privacy glass rolled up, plunging us instantly into quiet safety. Dominic's assistant leaned back from the front seat and handed Dominic a sleek silver USB drive. The assistant explained quietly, that DeAndre had slipped it into his tuxedo pocket during the commotion, whispering that it was Vanguard's proprietary pitch. Dominic scoffed loudly, tossing the silver drive carelessly into my lap. "Let us deeply see what your corrupt brother-in-law thinks is truly worth a $50 million investment," he said, pouring us both a crisp glass of sparkling water. I opened my laptop, plugged in the drive, and bypassed DeAndre's basic security encryption in absolutely less than 30 seconds. I smoothly opened the master file containing the proprietary trading algorithm Vanguard was desperately offering to sell. I stared intensely at the lines of complex code, the highly specialized risk assessment formulas, and the incredibly unique data sequence. My blood ran completely, terrifyingly cold. The air in my lungs entirely vanished. "Dominic," I whispered, my hands shaking as I gripped the edges of the laptop. "These are not just investment projections. I know this code. I built this proprietary algorithm 5 years ago, during my final year of grad school. My father told me it was worthless garbage and forced me to delete it." I looked up at Dominic, tears of absolute rage stinging my eyes. "He stole it. Vanguard is entirely built on my stolen work." The adrenaline from the limo ride had completely kept my eyes wide open until dawn. My father had not just dismissed my talent. He had aggressively stolen it, weaponized it, and built his failing empire directly on the back of my genius. I stood quietly by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite in Dominic's estate, watching the morning sun gently break over the manicured grounds. Today was my 33rd birthday. According to the ironclad, specific stipulations of my late mother's will, today was the day her private trust fund fully unlocked for me. It was $2 million of clean, untouchable money, separate from Vanguard Asset Management. Claiming those funds was the final, definitive step in severing my ties to Charles and his corrupt corporate cult. I requested Dominic's driver to take me straight into the financial district. I absolutely did not dress in the aggressive power suits my sister Brittany favored. I wore a simple, beautifully tailored black sheath dress, projecting nothing but absolute, terrifying calm. I walked smoothly through the brass doors of Sterling Horizon Bank, effortlessly bypassing the main teller lines and approaching the private wealth management desk. I securely requested my mother's portfolio. The receptionist carefully checked my identification, her polite smile instantly faltering as she stared at her monitor. She hurriedly picked up her secure phone. 10 minutes later, Mr. Abernathy, the senior vice president who had personally known my mother, scurried nervously into the lobby. He absolutely did not offer a warm birthday greeting. He looked absolutely terrified, his pale face slick with a thin layer of cold sweat. Mr. Abernathy rushed me safely into his soundproofed mahogany office and securely locked the door right behind us. He practically collapsed into his leather chair. He violently pushed a single, painfully thin manila folder across the polished wood directly toward me. He completely could not even bring himself to meet my eyes when he spoke. He stuttered violently, profusely apologizing before confirming the exact balance. 0. I stared down at the crisp white sheet of paper deeply resting in the folder. $2 million, the exact, only safety net my mother had managed to desperately scrape together for my future, was completely gone. I absolutely did not raise my voice. I leaned forward and demanded the full, unredacted withdrawal records immediately. Abernathy's hands shook violently as he produced a secondary file from his locked drawer. The money had been rapidly wired out completely in a single lump sum 6 months ago. I traced my finger violently down the ledger to the authorization signature. It read Charles. My father absolutely had zero legal access to this highly specific trust. A fact written carefully into the bylaws purely by my mother. Eiley demanded to deeply know how a premier bank had allowed this massive illegal breach. Abernathy, wiping his forehead violently with a monogrammed handkerchief, explained that Charles had entirely not used his status as my father. He had confidently presented a comprehensive, notarized power of attorney. Healy handed me a direct copy of the exact legal decree. I scanned the black text, my vision narrowing. Charles had successfully petitioned a private, compensated judge using a thick stack of fabricated medical records. The legal document officially declared me mentally unfit to manage my own personal and financial affairs. The complex puzzle pieces from the charity gala the night before slammed together with sickening clarity. Brittany's loud, calculated comments to Dominic about my supposed history of severe mental instability were not just born purely of petty jealousy. She was laying the public groundwork. They had stolen my money, and they were trying to steal my sanity to cover their tracks and legally bind me to their control forever. I did not scream. Illy did not shed a single tear. Crying was what a mentally unstable person would do, and I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I calmly gathered the fraudulent documents, slid them securely into my leather tote bag, thanked Ailey hyperventilating Mr. Abernathy for his time, and walked out of the bank with my spine straight. I directed the driver straight back to Dominic's estate. My father completely truly deeply believed Ailey forged signature, and a fake psychological diagnosis could completely stop me. He entirely forgot that I track missing, hidden, and stolen money entirely for a living. I strode straight back into the home office Dominic had provided for me. Leo was safely sitting on the rug, silently building a complex tower out of wooden blocks. He looked up, his dark eyes studying my face. He sensed the shift in my energy immediately. Healy stood up, walked over to my desk, and placed a single blue block right next to my keyboard. It was his silent show of explicit solidarity. Eiley smiled, thanking him softly before locking my eyes onto the dual monitors. I cracked my knuckles and booted up my forensic accounting software. Eiley plugged in Vanguard's hidden routing numbers, the ones I had extracted from DeAndre's stolen USB drive the night before. I cross-referenced those internal Vanguard accounts with the destination routing numbers from my mother's drained trust fund. The software hummed lines of code, racing down the screen as Eiley pulled the digital threads. I needed to know where Charles had hidden my $2 million. He had not used it to plug Vanguard's massive liquidity crisis. The timestamps on the corporately ledgers did not match the firm's financially bleeding. My father had stolen my inheritance for something entirely different. The money trail was incredibly sophisticated, designedly to fool federal regulators. But it was not smartly enough to fool me. The $2 million had bounced through 3 offshore Shelley corporations in the Cayman Islands and the Isle of Man. From there, it was filtered back into the United States, landing squarely in a domestic shell company registered in upstate New York. I ran the tax identification number through a restricted federal database I had access to. The entity was not a corporate asset or a real estate holding firm. Heavy Italy was a private medical clinic. Eiley dug deeper into the clinic's publicly registry and state licensing files. Heavy Italy was an elite, highly secretive, long-term psychiatric care facility, hidden deep in the mountains. Heavy Eiley pulled the clinic's inbound payment ledgers and bypassedly their basic administratively firewall. Charles was not justly paying them off or making a charitable donation. Fiercely, he was fully funding a specific patient's permanent involuntary confinement. Fiercely, I isolated the payment code and cracked open the specifically patient ledger tied to my stolen $2 million. The name on the filly flashed onto my screen. My blood turned to absolute ice. And the air completely vanished from my lungs. Dominic walked into the office just as I backed away from the desk. Dominic, Eiley choked out, pointing a trembling finger at the glowing monitor. My mother did not die in a car accident 15 years ago. Fiercely, she is the patient. Dominic stood frozenly behind my chair. Fiercely, he looked at the glowing monitor, then down at my trembling hands. Fiercely, he did not offer empty platitudes or uselessly apologies. Fiercely, he immediately pulled out his encrypted phone and dispatched his elite private security team to the upstate New York clinic, with strict orders to secure the facility and protect the patient at all costs. My mother was alive. For 15 years Charles had kept her locked away, medicated and entirely isolated, feeding me a fabricated story about a fatal car crash to ensure he retained absolute control over Vanguard and her personal wealth. The sheer magnitude of my father's evil threatened to consume me. but I refused to let the shock paralyze my mind. I channeled every ounce of my grief, every year of feeling like the family outcast into a weapon of pure, unadulterated focus. I turned back to the Julie monitors. I was no longer just auditing a company. I was dismantling an empire. My fingers flew across the keyboard, executing rapid-fire bypass protocols and launching aggressive packet sniffers to unearth Vanguard's deepest, most guarded servers. I tracked the routing numbers tied to Thiele Upstate Clinic backward through the Cayman Island shell companies, slicing through DeAndre's pathetic digital firewalls like a hot knife through butter. I pulled Thiele Master Offshore Ledger, the true unredacted financial heartbeat of Vanguard Asset Management. The numbers flooded my screens in a cascading waterfall of data. I isolated my stolenly $2 million trust fund, watching the digital footprint of the money as it hit the offshorely account. It had not just sat there collecting interest. It had been aggressively sliced, diced, and routed through dozens of dummy corporations and fake vendor invoices. I set up a tracking algorithm to follow every single cent, demanding the software flag any account that shared a commonly beneficiary. The results populated instantly, mapping a sprawling web of absolutely greed. A massive chunk of my stolen inheritance had been routed directly into an untraceable LLC, registeredly under Brittany's maiden name. I opened the expensely reports for that specific LLC, and the action-based backstory of my entire adult life played outly in undeniable black and white numbers. I saw the wire transfer for Brittany's $100,000 custom, Vera Wang weddingly dress. I traced the routing numbers that purchased DeAndre's fleet of imported Italian sportsly cars. I found the extravagant invoices for their monthly luxury vacations to Aspen, Paris, and Dubai. While my father was telling me I was a financial burden, while he watched Millie work 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford ramen noodles and my accounting textbooks, he was actively funneling my dead mother's money to fund the golden child's picture-perfect, opulent lifestyle. Brittany had built her entire socialite persona on the foundation of my stolen future and my mother's forced imprisonment. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached, but as I continued to follow the money, the narrative shifted from personal betrayal to corporate treason. The remaining balance of my $2 million had not been spent on luxury goods. It had been used to plug a massive, gaping hole in one of Vanguard's primary domestic payout accounts. I zoomed out, expanding my forensic sweep to encompass the entirety of Vanguard's incoming and outgoing client funds over the past decade. I cross-referenced their public liquidity reports with the hidden offshore ledgers. The datasets completely contradicted each other. Vanguard was claiming a consistently 20% year-over-year growth to the SEC and their investors, but the internal reality was an absolute bloodbath. They were hemorrhaging money. None of their proprietary algorithms actually worked. The tech sector investments DeAndre had touted at the gala were entirely fictitious. I mapped the flow of incoming capital against the outgoing dividend payments. A chilling, unmistakable pattern emerged on the screen. Vanguard Asset Management was not generating any actual profit. Charles and DeAndre were taking the massive capital deposits from new clients and immediately routing those exact funds to pay the guaranteed dividends of their older legacy clients. They were cooking the books, fabricating the growth statements, and constantly scrambling to secure fresh victims to prevent the entire house of cards from collapsing. Vanguard was not an asset management firm. It was a massive multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The puzzle was finally complete. The sudden, desperate push to sell my office building. The aggressive, unannounced ambush at my apartment. The hostile takeover attempt at the charity gala. Charles and DeAndre were completely out of cash. Their offshore reserves were bone dry. The legacy clients were demanding their quarterly payouts. And Vanguard had absolutely nothing left to give them. I looked at the projected payout schedules on my left monitor. Vanguard needed a massive influx of untraceable liquid capital by Friday, or the SEC would be alerted to the defaults, and the federal indictments would follow within hours. I looked at the $50 million investment proposal DeAndre had slipped into Dominic's assistant's pocket. Dominic's corporate pension fund was the exact target. They did not want a strategic partnership. They needed a sacrificial lamb to keep their Ponzi scheme alive for one more quarter. And they were planning to gut the retirement savings of thousands of Dominic's hard-working employees to do it. My printer whirred to life in the corner of the office. I had commanded the software to compile the ultimate, undeniable proof of the massive fraud. I stood up, walked over to the tray, and picked up the single, warm sheet of paper. It detailed the entire fraudulent loop, complete with Charles and DeAndre's authorizing digital signatures and the exact trail of the stolen money. I turned to Dominic. He was watching me closely, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. I handed him the paper, my hands no longer shaking. "Dominic," I said, my voice eerily calm and entirely devoid of fear. "Vanguard is not just failing, DeAndre and Charles are running a massive Ponzi scheme. They stole my algorithm to make the company look legitimate, and their absolute next target is your corporate pension fund." Dominic's silence was absolute. He stared at the single sheet of paper in his hands, his eyes aggressively tracking the undeniable trail of federal crimes, offshore shell companies, and the horrific, brutal reality of my mother's captivity. The air in the room grew, highly charged with a lethal kind of stillness. He did not shout. He did not throw anything. The billionaires who built empires from scratch rarely did. Instead, his gaze lifted to meet mine, and I saw a cold, calculating predator looking back at me. "We cannot call the FBI right now," Dominic said, his deep voice dropping to a low, incredibly murmur. I blinked, the adrenaline still surging through my veins. "What are you talking about?" "I have the exact routing numbers. I have the highly forged medical decrees. They are aggressively torturing my mother and ruthlessly plotting to steal $50 million from your own employees. And if we hand this to the federal authorities right now," Dominic countered, stepping closer, "Charles will hire a dozen highly priced defense attorneys before the ink on the warrant is dry. He will claim DeAndre acted completely alone. DeAndre will claim a glitch in the algorithm. They will stall. They will shred the physical evidence at Vanguard. And they might find the exact way to move your mother before my security team breaches that clinic." He paused, his eyes with lethal intent. White-collar criminals thrive in the gray areas of a prolonged investigation. We are not going to give them a prolonged investigation. We are going to bury them under the explicit weight of their own explicit greed. He placed the paper flat on the mahogany explicit desk. We need them to commit active, undeniable explicit fraud on a monitored explicit server. We need DeAndre to attempt the theft of the explicit pension fund, using my internal network. Explicitly. Once he crosses that digital threshold, the crime is locked in federal jurisdiction with zero room for legal maneuvering. I looked at the complex server architecture displayed on my screens. "You want me to build a honeypot?" "I want you to build a digital explicit guillotine," Dominic corrected gently. He picked up his encrypted smartphone, tapped a few commands, and placed it on speakerphone in the center of the explicit desk. He dialed my father's direct private line. It rang twice before Charles answered. His voice dripped with manufactured authority, but I could hear the microscopic tremor of panic hiding just beneath the explicit surface. Charles knew the clock was ticking on his offshore accounts. "Dominic," Charles boomed cheerfully, feigning casual confidence, "I was not expecting to hear from you until next week. I trust my sister-in-law has not been causing you too much trouble. I must apologize again for her outburst at the explicit gala. We are currently looking into getting her the psychiatric help she desperately needs." My fingernails dug into my palms, leaving deep half-moon crescent in my skin. Dominic did not even flinch. "Cassidy has been entirely professional, Charles," Dominic lied smoothly, his tone projecting the exact arrogance of an interested investor. "In fact, she just walked me through the proprietary algorithm." DeAndre slipped to my assistant. "I have to admit, I am highly impressed. The risk assessment metrics are what I need to stabilize my corporate pension fund." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the speaker. I could practically see the dollar signs flashing in my father's eyes. "You are interested in moving forward with the $50 million integration?" Charles asked, failing to keep the desperate eagerness out of his explicit voice. I am interested in fast-tracking it, Dominic replied smoothly. I do not like leaving capital sitting idle. I want to execute the contracts and initiate the digital handshake tonight. Bring DeAndre and Brittany to my estate at 8 o'clock. We will have a private signing dinner, finalize the integration and toast to our new partnership. Of course, Charles agreed instantly, his relief palpable through the line. We will be there, thank you, Dominic. You will not regret this. Dominic ended the call. He looked at me, a dangerous smirk playing on his lips. The bait is taken, now set the trap. I spent the next 6 hours transforming Dominic's expansive boardroom into a technological dead end. I routed the main presentation displays to a hidden partition on my laptop. I created a mirrored dummy server for Dominic's pension fund. To DeAndre's eyes, it would look like an unsecured $50 million asset pool ready for the taking. But the moment his Vanguard credentials interacted with my code, the system would instantly lock him out, copy his hard drive, and trigger an automated, unrecallable data dump directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and the New York State Attorney General. While compiling the presentation that would accompany their arrest, I pulled the lifestyle receipts. I loaded high-definition scans of Brittany's $100,000 Vera Wang's wedding dress receipt, right next to the corresponding withdrawal from my mother's stolen trust fund. I placed the deeds for DeAndre's fleet of imported Italian sports cars next to the falsified psychiatric evaluation Charles had used to steal the money. I was going to force them to look at the exact cost of their arrogance. As I finalized the firewall parameters, the oak door of the boardroom creaked open. I turned away from the glowing monitors, my nerves completely frayed. Little Leo stood in the doorway. He was wearing his pajamas, clutching a piece of wrinkled construction paper in his small hands. He did not run away when I looked at him. He walked slowly across the long room, stopping right beside my chair. He looked up at me, his dark eyes wide and serious, and handed me the paper. I took it gently. It was a drawing done in vibrant, messy crayons. It showed 3 stick figures standing on a patch of green grass beneath a bright yellow sun. A tall man in a dark suit, a woman in a black dress, and a little boy standing right between them. We were a family. Thank you, Leo, I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. I placed the drawing carefully on the edge of my desk, right next to the glowing monitors, armed with my digital explicit guillotine. Now, I said to myself, standing up and smoothing my black dress. Let us welcome my family to dinner. At 8 o'clock, the brass gates of Dominic's estate swung open, admitting the sleek silver Bentley. I stood with Dominic in the grand foyer, as my father, sister, and brother-in-law were escorted inside by the security team. They looked like absolute royalty, adorned in their finest designer clothes, their faces plastered with eager, greedy smiles. Charles stepped forward first, his hand outstretched toward Dominic. Dominic, he boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. A magnificent evening for a magnificent partnership. Dominic took his hand, his grip firm and his smile entirely predatory. Indeed, Charles. Let us proceed directly to the boardroom. The contracts are ready for execution. Brittany sneered at me as she walked past, her nose turned up in explicit disdain. DeAndre shot me a look of pure triumph, completely convinced he had successfully manipulated the situation and secured Vanguard's salvation. They had absolutely no idea they were walking willingly into an impenetrable digital explicit slaughterhouse. We entered the expansive boardroom. I had the lights dimmed slightly, the massive screens at the front of the room, currently displaying a generic corporate logo for Dominic's holding company. Please, have a seat, Dominic offered, gesturing to the luxurious leather chairs arranged around the long mahogany table. DeAndre sat down eagerly, immediately pulling a sleek silver laptop from his designer briefcase. I have the integration protocols queued up on my end, Dominic, DeAndre said smoothly. Once we execute the physical contracts, I can initiate the transfer sequence and sync our systems. Excellent, Dominic said, taking a seat at the head of the table. Cassidy, if you would be so kind as to guide us through the final verification process. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly to the front of the room. I picked up the small remote control for the massive screens. Of course, Dominic, I said, my voice echoing with lethal precision. Before we authorize the transfer of $50 million from your corporate pension fund, I thought it prudent to review the specific assets Vanguard brings to the table. Charles frowned slightly, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Cassidy, we have already provided the detailed prospectus. This is highly irregular, bear with me, Dad, I said coldly. I assure you, this presentation is highly illuminating. I clicked the remote. The generic corporate logo on the massive screens vanished instantly. In its place, a high-definition image splashed across the display. It was the unredacted medical decree Charles had used to falsely declare me mentally incompetent. Right next to it was the corresponding wire transfer, showing the immediate draining of my mother's $2 million trust fund. The color completely drained from Charles's face. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning bone white. "What is this, Cassidy?" Charles demanded, his voice shaking with sudden uncontrollable panic. "Turn that off immediately." I ignored him and clicked the remote again. The screen shifted to display the highly classified offshore routing numbers I had tracked from the Caymans. The image clearly showed the massive chunks of stolen money being funneled directly into the shell company, registered to Brittany's maiden name. Alongside the routing numbers, I projected the crystal-clear invoices for her Vera Wang wedding dress and DeAndre's imported Italian sports cars. "It seems, Dominic," I announced smoothly, "that Vanguard's primary asset generation strategy involves stealing trust funds from mentally declared incompetent family members to fund luxury vacations and designer wardrobes." Brittany gasped loudly, her hands flying to cover her mouth. She looked at the screen, then at me, sheer terror radiating from her eyes. You hacked into my private accounts," she shrieked. "I audited them, Brittany," I corrected coldly. "And the numbers are quite damning." DeAndre slammed his laptop shut, his face a mask of pure fury. "Dominic, this is a setup. She is completely insane. She has fabricated all of this to ruin the deal." "Fabricated?" Dominic asked quietly, his voice incredibly dangerous. "I find that difficult to believe, DeAndre. Especially since my own security team is currently securing the upstate New York psychiatric clinic your father-in-law has been secretly funding for 15 years. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. Charles froze, his eyes completely wide with stark, absolute horror. He looked at Dominic, his entire body trembling. You sent people to the clinic?" "My mother is safe, Charles," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "She is no longer your medicated prisoner, your leverage is gone." DeAndre, sensing the total collapse of their entire empire, acted on pure desperate survival instinct. He ripped open his laptop, his fingers flying frantically across the keyboard. He was desperately trying to access the dummy server I had built, frantically attempting to initiate the transfer sequence and drain the $50 million before we could stop him. "Initiating transfer," DeAndre muttered frantically, his eyes locked on his screen. "I just need to authorize the link." He hit the enter key. Instantly, the massive screens at the front of the room flashed a brilliant, blinding crimson red. A loud, sharp buzzer sounded through the boardroom speakers. "Assess denied" flashed in massive white letters across the screens. DeAndre stared at his laptop, which had completely frozen. The screen on his device turned pitch black, displaying a single small loading bar that was rapidly filling up. "What is happening?" DeAndre shouted, aggressively mashing the keys on his frozen laptop. "Unlock the system." "You just crossed the threshold, DeAndre," I said calmly, placing the remote gently on the table. "You just used Vanguard's stolen proprietary algorithm to attempt the theft of a $50 million corporate pension fund. My honeypot completely isolated your system, locked you out, and is currently dumping your entire hard drive, along with all of Vanguard's internal offshore ledgers, directly to the SEC and the FBI. You are going to federal prison," Dominic added smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. "And your entire family is going with you." The doors to the boardroom burst open. Half a dozen federal agents, flanked closely by Dominic's armed security team, stormed into the room. Charles collapsed into his chair, openly weeping as an agent handcuffed him. Brittany screamed hysterically, thrashing as two agents forcefully restrained her, ruining her expensive designer dress. DeAndre sat still, staring blankly at his locked laptop, the brutal reality of his destruction finally washing over him. I stood perfectly still, watching the chaotic ruin of the family that had tortured me my entire life. They had underestimated me at every single turn. They had told me I was crazy. They had told me I was a failure. I turned to Dominic. He was watching me, absolute respect and deep admiration glowing in his dark eyes. "It is done," I whispered quietly. "Yes, it is," Dominic replied softly, standing up and offering me his arm. "Let us go check on our son." I took his arm, turning my back on the screaming, completely ruined remnants of Vanguard Asset Management. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving the toxicity of my past permanently behind me, stepping forward into the brilliant, limitless future I had ruthlessly built for myself.